This is Howard Weaver. I'd like to read you the first chapter from my memoir of journalism in Alaska, Write Hard, Die Free. I think this will take about 13 minutes. This is Chapter 1, entitled Love at First Sight. Long before the end of my first year in a real newsroom, I knew my teenage marriage wasn't going to survive it. By the end of the next year, she knew too. The first time my young bride choked back tears and sobbed, "You love that damned newsroom more than you love me," I must have waited a split second too long before denying it. She never brought it up again, and I never admitted it, but by the time I moved out, we both knew it was true. My affection for the newsroom at the Anchorage Daily News was instantaneous, and my devotion never faltered. Like Paul on the road to Damascus, I was struck down by revelation. I belonged here, soaking up the well-blended cocktail of cynicism and idealism in a smoky room that looked a little like those news photos of trailer parks after a tornado. The mundane world of city streets and Rotary Club meetings was eclipsed here by a daily miracle of storytelling, fueled by equal parts of urgency, insecurity, and ambition. No matter what you were before, here you could become a byline, privileged to add your words to those delivered every day to doorsteps all over town. "Come on, kid," a veteran said after deadline one night. "We're done here. Let's go get drunk and be somebody." Well, I was all for drinking, but I already felt like somebody. Staff writer. It said so right under my name, often several times in a single edition. My dad, when he was sober enough to notice, was proud of me. And sometimes I didn't feel like the poor kid from a shabby neighborhood anymore. I couldn't imagine ever giving up this feeling. Yet inside I remained an insecure kid from Muldoon, and one day I would understand that the newsroom I adored was filled with fuck-ups and fragile egos every bit as twisted as my own. Nobody came to work in an understaffed, underpaid, overworked newsroom at the dying No. 2 daily newspaper in Anchorage, Alaska, because they had selected it over all their other bright prospects. A few, like me, were young and hungry, learning something every day and still naive enough to believe this was a launching pad, not a warehouse. Others were not. Everybody was a drinker, most were divorced or headed in that direction, and as far as I knew, only one person, the editor, owned a home. The apartments and old rental houses we shared were interchangeably shabby, cramped and aged quarters filled with musty, rust-colored carpets and slightly moldering furniture, where there was any furniture at all. Wobbly old refrigerators were full of cheap beer, the cabinets held whiskey, and our medicine chests contained extra-large bottles of extra-strength Excedrin, often with the top removed and simply thrown away. A gray film of accumulated cigarette smoke coated the inside of every window. Unless the living room smelled like patchouli oil, it smelled of tobacco and cheap marijuana. There was no desk available for me when I started at the Daily News. Instead, I shifted around the small, crowded newsroom to occupy whatever spot was vacant at the moment. I got up and moved without being asked whenever a venerable veteran returned. I couldn't touch type then, still can't. And sometimes I got stuck with an old manual typewriter where most of the frequently used keys had been worn smooth. Was this the A or the S key under my finger? Which is the R and which is the T? A few months after my arrival, an old-timer, he was probably 35, I realize now, passed me in the hallway on his way out. "Looks like you've got a desk now, kid," he told me. That was Dan, a frequent lunchtime martini drinker and would-be novelist who had just finished a spectacular series on big game bandits, ruthless mercenary guides who broke all the rules in leading trophy hunters, usually tourists, to prized kills. His florid, sanguinary descriptions and withering analysis had caused upheaval at the State Department of Fish and Game and brought telephone death threats to the newsroom. I was stunned to be told he had just been fired. I never learned why, but I moved my stuff into his desk later that afternoon. The city editor delighted in my clumsiness and rookie anxiety and loved to hiss, "Pressure, pressure, deadline, deadline," while flicking paper clips that bounced off the back of my head. Despite my lack of typing skill or experience, I turned out to be a fast, clean writer, and within a few months I could frustrate his sport by turning in copy that not only satisfied the editors, but often made it onto the front page. Except for the sports section, I was the only local with a byline. I could tell that some of the older colleagues thought of me as a kind of teacher's pet, maybe the newsroom mascot, but they didn't seem to mind that my uninterrupted, voluminous production took some pressure off of them to fill the paper's daily news hole. It wasn't uncommon for veterans to reassign to me some story that they didn't want to cover. I always said yes, always came back with something, and occasionally surprised them and the editors by coming back with something good. The characters I worked with in that newsroom could have been cast for the film The Front Page, and many cultivated their eccentricities. Many images spring readily to mind. Molly Bowditch, who worked at Time magazine, was an unlikely, sophisticated transplant from Mount Holyoke College. They taught us to pronounce it like the whole yolk of an egg, she once explained. She smoked Pall Malls and filled her tiny, rented house with Great Danes. Alan Frank, instantly recognizable by a mop of tangled hair and a perpetually frantic demeanor, was a big city boy, a graduate of Columbia Journalism School whose father in New York City ran Family Weekly, one of the newspaper industry's biggest Sunday supplements. Jean Montague, soon to become Jean Abbott, the editor's wife, was only a little bit older than me, but behaved with poise I admired from across the tattered newsroom. Elaine Warren was a winsome girl just about my age who seemed infinitely more worldly than I. Though her grandfather had mined for gold in Juneau and her dad was born there, she had lived in California and was a stylish writer and dresser who drove a Carmen Ghia. At the desk next to her was A. Cameron Edmondson, who invariably asked me, Marion or Berrien, whenever I showed up with a necktie. He wore his wristwatch on his ankle to keep track of the time as he sat cross-legged and churned out business stories. Our bosses weren't that much older than their staffers and certainly were no less strange. Tom Brown had been a foreign correspondent. He was 6 feet 6 inches of talent, energy, and cynicism on the city desk. He moved our typewritten copy to the production department by slamming open a sliding plexiglass window and shouting, "Eat it up, you rats," as he tossed it out into a wire basket. Tom Giboney was the managing editor, but like everybody, handled multiple duties. He edited the sports page or the front page with equal panache, and once admitted to me that he had washed out of officer candidate school in the Army because he lacked respect for authority. The big boss was Stan Abbott, our executive editor and a steadfast mentor who opened more doors for me than I realized until much later. He had hired me as a stringer when he was sports editor and I was a 16-year-old high school junior, ordering up stories on wrestling matches and hockey games that paid me about $5 each. Far more importantly, they put my byline in the paper. Seemingly equal parts Jack Kerouac and Jack Daniels, he loomed large in my career until his departure years later, which likewise opened an important door for me. Outside the newsroom, the most important people in my world were at the Club China Doll. Proprietor Louis Jiggs Gigliotti and cocktail waitress Loma Boarding, who tirelessly fetched drinks and flirted until our paychecks were gone or Jiggs' patience was exhausted. In my early days, the paper still largely reflected the legacy of legendary Chicago newsman Larry Fanning, the editor and publisher who had died a classic newsman's deadline death at his desk in that same newsroom a year before I arrived. We believed in gangsters and crooked politicians and breathless headlines. Struggling late one night for the right headline to put on photos of a remote shipwreck and rescue. Drama in the fog, one proposed. Another liked Life and Death in the North Atlantic. The editors finally asked Larry for help. He immediately turned and dictated, "First pictures of Aleutian rescue." In his legacy newsroom, I learned to write every story to its limit, and sometimes a step or two beyond. A barroom killing at the Beef and Bourbon nightclub early in my career became the double shotgun slaying in every reference thereafter, and I still have the folder of notes and tips with which I fully expected to solve the case myself. I didn't. When Gary Zeger, the brother of a high school friend, was charged in a gruesome murder, I was ready. The victim, a fetching young woman with the made-for-headline name of ZZ Mason, was discovered stabbed to death in an isolated gravel pit on the edge of town. Ziegler was charged on the basis of classic whodunit circumstantial evidence. He was guilty by virtue of his reputation amongst the city cops and was suspected of even more gruesome killings. The two talented young public defenders who handled his case won a change of venue to Kodiak, an island town in the Gulf of Alaska, on account of our coverage, resulting in my first out-of-town assignment. The city's dominant daily, the Anchorage Times, wouldn't spring for airfare to send their reporter, so I would have this story to myself. The veteran Times court reporter I competed against was jealous but not spiteful, collegially advising me to take along a receipt book and 2 different colored pens to give my expense accounts more credibility. Communications in Alaska were still primitive in the early 1970s, and I suspect I might have been one of the last newspaper reporters in the country to file stories by telegraph, as I did from Kodiak. In those days, before Alaskans had access even to the primitive telecopy or fax machine that Hunter Thompson dubbed the Mojo Wire, I had to finish each day's story between the end of the court session at 3:30 or 4 p.m. and the closing of the telegraph office at 6 p.m. That left no time to travel out the road to the house where I was staying, at no cost to the newspaper, with a friend of a friend. So I set up shop at a little round table in a corner of Tony's bar, cranking out coverage on the portable typewriter my uncle had carried through the Korean War. The trial lasted almost 3 weeks, and my daily visit soon became a feature at Tony's, where a pretty dancer named Jean and other employees began to cluster around the table for a daily update when I arrived. As much as I enjoyed this Damon Runyon fantasy, I worried at first about wasting time with my unbreakable telegraph deadline looming. After a few days, though, I learned to use their reactions to help organize and shape my stories before I started writing, highlighting the scenes that had captured their attention. An early example, perhaps, of crowdsourcing. I'd always been more interested in writing for the readers than for the copy desk, and the success of my front page exclusives from Tony's bar day after day did little to tone me down. Gary Ziegler was found not guilty after his lawyers produced a surprise witness who said she had seen ZZ alive after the time prosecutors fixed for the killing. A storybook ending I wish I had written as well as its Raymond Chandler plot deserved. I got better, though, and a year or so later, Gary Ziegler was to figure prominently in the best crime story and one of the best leads I ever wrote.